Chris Speaks here, back again tonight with my man, Dr. Lucas Wilder. Always one of my favorite episodes, or favorite nights of the week. And tonight we're going to talk about Chancellorsville. Lucas, how are you, my man?
I'm doing just fine, Chris. I'm glad to be talking with you again.
Oh man, always a highlight of the month. Okay, so quick intro. We're after Fredericksburg. What happens leading up to May?
Uh, Both basically the Union and Confederate armies are sitting and watching one another across the Rappahannock River for much of the wintertime. Lee is having a hard time supplying his force, and so he's actually spreading out his troops throughout much of the South. And so they're still relatively close to Fredericksburg, but they're fairly spread out in order to be able to subsist off the land and not wear out the supplies of one or any one given spot. The Union Army are getting supplied really well, and Burnside has been reassigned. He gets sent to the Western Theater, and his Ninth Corps gets sent down to the peninsula, down to Fort Monroe, where the Peninsula Campaign began the year before that. And so the Ninth Union Corps is down in the peninsula, and the Union Army is essentially just biding their time. They are making plans, though. General Joseph Hooker has replaced Burnside, and they're attempting to find a way to defeat Robert E. Lee. And one way they want to defeat him is hopefully break him away from those Fredericksburg defenses and possibly threaten Richmond. They send out a cavalry raid, the Union do, and it doesn't. The first attempt gets bogged down in the rain. The mud gets too bad; they can't move. They can't sufficiently move across over land, so that fails. They do try to launch another one, but it's not very successful. Hooker is actually a fairly great organizer. I know we talk about McClellan being a wonderful organizer, but I don't think you should count out General Hooker. Hooker is a phenomenal organizer, and Burnside had a little bit of chaos within his army organization, but Hooker comes in, and one thing the soldiers love about Hooker is that he reorganizes the furlough system. So if you get a regular furlough from the army, which increases morale, if you know you're going to get to go home at a certain time, it might not be right now, but you're guaranteed it in a month or two, you're going to be a happier soldier. And so Hooker actually builds up the morale of the Union forces, and he has over like 130,000 men around just outside of Fredericksburg across the Rappahannock River from Robert E. Lee. Robert
Lee
E.
must
Lee,
have lost some troops, didn't he? Because went he down to like 60 or 65,000?
he's around 60,000 when the battle actually takes place, the Battle of Chancellorsville, but he has somewhere around a little over 70,000 men
Okay.
at this point. Now, the reason I mentioned that Burnside his Ninth Corps was sent to the peninsula is that's the reason Robert E. Lee has to divide his force that winter or that early spring when Hooker goes on the offensive. Robert E. Lee has to send uh, James Longstreet with two divisions, John Bell Hood's and George Pickett's divisions, down to the peninsula to hopefully stave off any advance that the Ninth Corps might push towards up the peninsula towards Richmond. So that lowers him down to about 60,000 men, definitely only about half of what the Union Army has. General Joseph Hooker will he does a wonderful feint that he puts troops in their normal position, and then he secretly goes further west on the Rappahannock River, and is going to cross over. His plan is to hopefully attack Robert E. Lee from the front and the rear at the same time and cause a double envelopment and actually destroy Robert E. Lee's army. It's a bold plan, and it's a good plan. He has the numbers to do it. He
Oh,
has
that's how he had him called in that by scripts.
Yeah, that's the plan. Is that he left two corps across the Rappahannock River from Fredericksburg, and he was going to take the rest of the army, which is around 70,000 men, around all the way to the west, and come up from behind and take Lee from the rear. And then when he attacks, then both of them are going to attack at the same time in just a pincer movement and just envelop Robert E. Lee's army. It's a good plan. It really is. I give Hooker a lot of credit. But when the battle starts to take place, that's when it all goes awry. He starts moving his men across the Rappahannock River, and when they move across the river, they're going into what's called the wilderness. Most people
Hmm.
understand what the wilderness is, and I think we even discussed it on one of our first podcasts or first videos we ever did. We talked about the Battle of the Wilderness. Now, the Battle of Chancellorsville happens in relatively the same area as the Battle of the Wilderness. And the wilderness is actually second growth forest. The iron furnace that was there in the Chancellorsville area consumed a lot of wood. And so they cut down all the trees, and all this is secondary growth. So it's really a tangled mess. When Hooker is going to move across the river and go into Chancellorsville, he knows he needs to get out of the wilderness in order to meet Robert E. Lee on open ground that he will have the advantage because he's got numerical superiority. And so as they start moving across the river, he starts to maneuver his men out of the wilderness. So, any questions so far?
Yeah. So when he's been doing this, what's Lee doing? Just taking his usual wait and see approach and wait for him to make a mistake.
Robert E. Lee does what Robert E. Lee always does. He lets his cavalry, which are the best in the entire world, probably as far as intelligence, with Jeb Stuart, let them do their job. Now, Hooker does surprise Jeb Stuart. He has done a great. That's why I say I give Hooker a lot of credit. He's able to maneuver a large force and get across the river almost before Jeb Stuart finds out what's happening. But he's able to
Okay.
do it. He's able to do it, and Stuart gets word to Robert E. Lee, and now Lee is faced with a decision. Hooker has obviously divided his force. How much has he divided it? He's going to have to take a risk, and it's probably Lee's greatest gamble. There's a historian that called this battle Lee's perfect victory or perfect battle.
A
I would,
masterpiece, or
yeah, I would. This is probably Robert E. Lee's greatest gamble that he ever
gotcha.
does, because when Hooker is across the river and his men start coming out of the wilderness, Robert E. Lee does something that most generals probably wouldn't ever do. He divides his force. He, there's about roughly 40,000 men across the Rappahannock River from his force. He leaves around 15,000 to guard to guard against those 40,000, and he sends the rest west. And he uses James Longstreet's two divisions under McLaws and Anderson, and they slam into the Union forces out in the open. Uh, Initially, McLaws is wanting to form a defensive battle, and that might have gave Hooker an incentive to keep pushing. But when Stonewall Jackson comes up to McLaws's lines, he orders a general advance of the Confederate forces, and they push them back in. They give put up such a resistance that Hooker gets scared. Robert E. Lee has called Hooker's bluff. This is the critical moment of the Battle of Chancellorsville, I think.
He gives up the initiative.
He does. He gives it up completely when Robert E. Lee uses aggressive tactics against him.
And that's one of our most important principles of war.
Yeah, he withdraws into the wilderness. Now Robert E. Lee has him. He's went into this tangled mess, and even now Robert E. Lee's numbers are, well, the superior numbers that Hooker has is no concern to Robert E. Lee. It's gonna now he can maneuver around. So Hooker is inside of this thick, dense wilderness and
Followed up.
bottled up. Robert E. Lee Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson have a council of war. Like, what is going to be the next move?
Now
And
Hooker, I mean, excuse me, Stuart reported though his flanks in the air, correct?
well, we're getting there. Yeah,
Oh,
we're getting
I'm
there.
sorry. Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. Lee and Jackson are meeting, and they're discussing what's going to happen. And Jackson's suggesting a few areas to attack the line, and then Jeb Stuart rides up and informs General Lee that Hooker's right flank is what military people in the military call in the air, meaning it's not dug in. It's not against any natural barrier like a river or a mountain. It is in the air. It's perfect to attack. And Robert E. Lee again will take another big gamble. He not only divides his force the first time, now he divides it a second time. 3 if you count him sending Longstreet down to the peninsula. So in all,
Oh, wow.
he's divided his force 3 times in the face of numerically superior numbers.
That just defies every military
And
principle.
he takes this huge gamble, and I swear if Hooker would have been a little aggressive, Lee would have been defeated here easily. I do honestly believe this.
I'm
It
sorry, go ahead.
just blows my mind how Hooker, with those huge numbers, is going to let Robert E. Lee, with aggressive tactics, put him in his place.
I've,
It's
I've
it's
said
odd.
I've said before that Robert E. Lee is the only person in history that could have won that battle.
He is. I do think so. I don't. Well, I'll say another one. Grant may have. Grant has enough aggressive tactics in him that he may have been a big enough of a gambler to do that, but I can't say it for sure. Lee
Well, I know
is.
Grant would have won if he'd been Hooker.
Oh gosh, yes. He wouldn't have pulled back into the wilderness for one
No.
thing. Um, anyway, so yeah, Lee is now going to divide his force for the 3rd time counting Longstreet, but the 2nd time counting just for this one battle. He tells Stonewall Jackson to maneuver his men along. It's going to be a 12-mile flanking maneuver around the Union right flank. He's taken his entire corps. So this is the divisions of A.P. Hill, uh, Robert Rhodes, and General Colston. Those 3 divisions are going to slam into the Union right flank in the afternoon of May 2nd. And the flank that he hits is controlled by Oliver Otis Howard and his 11th Corps.
What time did they start the march?
Are you talking about what time did
When
they,
when Jackson started his march?
the flanking maneuver or
Mhm.
the actual attack?
No, the flanking maneuver.
He starts it in the early morning of July 2nd. I mean, my July, May 2nd, because it's May 1st, the first kind of engagement takes place. And then what we see, um, uh, they have that meeting on May 1st. And then May 2nd is when Stonewall starts maneuvering his troops into that position. So it's a, it's a critical moment that Stonewall launches this attack, and it's kind of late in the day. The reason I think I would love to write a journal article or something about the time of battle, because different generals have different ideas about when to launch an attack. We always hear about dawn attacks. One reason you want a dawn attack is because now you have plenty of daylight to be able to do your battle. If you do a evening attack, you're usually outnumbered. And so this is perfect for Robert E. Lee. The reason you attack near the end of the day if you're outnumbered is because if you get repulsed, they can't launch a counter assault.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. That's a great.
That's the reason you launch a later attack. That's why I think Jackson launches his later attack, is because if something goes wrong, will allow him to pull back and still maintain the integrity of his army. But there's a problem with that. What if you're successful? And that's what happens exactly on May 2nd. Is he is successful. He rolls up the entire Union line and insists on continuing to push them. When he continues to push them, of course, the 18th North Carolina, it's nighttime. They see what they perceive as Union cavalry, and they shoot Jackson 3 times in the left arm. Of course, it's not. Of course, he's not. The wound doesn't kill him. Kill him. He is essentially. Um, he dies of pneumonia days later, but he's out of action. And what were you going to say?
There's 26,000 men coming out. They came out rebel yell, just pile driving that flank.
Mm-hmm. So
and,
I mean, it's incredible, and it's incredible that Jackson was able to coordinate that. I thought we talked last time or a couple times ago about the Battle of Shiloh and how Beauregard and Johnston were trying to coordinate 40,000 men in one attack. Uh, Again, 20,000 is not 40,000, but the fact that Jackson can coordinate this, it gives a lot of credit to him. And we see this throughout. And when I talk about General Hancock, he's able to maneuver a corps probably better than anyone in the Civil War battlefield. There's no one that can maneuver a corps as swiftly as General Winfield Scott Hancock, but Jackson does it extremely well here in the wilderness.
Now, why on earth is a corps commander in front between enemy lines after dark?
That's kind of his quirk. Well, anytime you see a general that enjoys battle, you'll see them closer to the front, and it's a given. That's what General Hancock stayed close to the front because he loved battle. He liked going into battle. That was his. He learned that when he was in the Mexican War. And so Jackson, from all accounts, actually enjoyed battle. He said his eyes would flare whenever battles erupted. He enjoyed it. I don't know how, and of course there are probably plenty of historians who will challenge me on that, but there's enough of some primary source material that would say that, yeah, Jackson was fond of battle, and so being out front. Plus, a good commander always goes out and scouts the position, and sometimes that puts you in a tight situation. And one good example of that, and one reason I'm bringing it up is because I'm doing the series on Claiborne, and
That's a great series, by the way.
thank you, Patrick Claiborne. One of the reasons he's very successful is he goes out and looks at the ground that his men are going to cross before they cross it. And he comes into a lot of hairy situations too, where he runs into Union forces, especially during the Atlanta campaign. He comes very close to possibly being killed by advanced guards or advanced skirmishers of the Union Army. So again, if you're a good commander, you do need to know what's ahead of you. Sending your men in blind is very dangerous, and so that's another reason Jackson would want to go in the lead at least.
Well, what you said about him enjoying battle, there's no doubt in my mind he did. I mean, all people who join, for the most part, who join the military, they love that's what they're going for. Lee's quote at Fredericksburg about war being so terrible. Yeah, I mean, I know it sounds bad, but there's a thirst for blood.
It's an adrenaline rush. There's some scientific studies on why people enjoy battle, but it's an adrenaline rush for a lot of people.
Now, let me ask you this question: any chance that Jackson got fragged?
Got bragged.
Frags, shot, killed by his own men.
Oh, sorry, I'm not familiar with the term.
Oh, my bad.
I thought you was talking about Braxton Bragg. I was like, oh, what does Stonewall Jackson and Braxton Bragg have in common? One of these is not like the other.
No, yeah, that's a term when the soldiers kill their own officer, frag, with an F.
Right. What was your question about it?
Yeah, I've read people speculate on that he was killed by. They knew it was him. He was disliked by a lot of the troops. They shot him.
I think he had more of a love-hate relationship with his men. Many of the men regarded him as almost an idol. The people who didn't like him were the high command. Whether it was A.P. Hill, Maxcy Gregg, a lot of men within his division commanders, many of them didn't like him. Robert Rhodes did. I'm not sure about Colson, but Hill didn't like him. And before that, his other division commander didn't care for him. One of his other division commanders didn't care for him. So I doubt that's a plausible thing.
So how did just curious. So the next day when they renewed the attacks, how did Stewart take over his corps?
Well, naturally, it would probably be one of the division commanders. But A.P. Hill, which is the most experienced division commander, is wounded as well. So he's unable to take command. Robert E. Lee trusts Jeb Stuart, and Jeb Stuart and Stonewall Jackson work extremely well together. That's one reason, and also it's who you can find at the time.
Ah,
Jeb Stuart had never commanded large amounts of, or actually commanded infantry at all, especially during the Civil War, except maybe on like smaller like, engagements where he was over a certain section of infantry troops. He had never commanded at a formal infantry column of infantry. But Stuart gets a lot of praise from historians for what he does the next day, because when Jackson goes down, he organizes the divisions of Stonewall Jackson wonderfully. Again, does a wonderful job of doing so. He places artillery really well. That's one thing that doesn't get talked about a lot. But Jeb Stuart, even though he was a cavalry commander, when he was in charge of artillery, his own artillery or someone else's like Jackson's, he was really good at placing it at the right moment to launch an attack to prepare an area for infantry to attack or cavalry to attack. Um, and that's what he does. He actually, you know, a general would have a buff sash, which is kind of an off-white sash that would tie around them, and then the belt would go over that. The morning of May 3rd, when he is put in command of Jackson's corps, he is so confident of of the artillery that the Confederacy has that he will actually tie a red sash in symbol of the artillery that day.
oh wow.
So, and he does. He launches Stonewall Jackson's corps against Hooker's men, and it's a bloody battle. It is horribly bloody. It is even May 2nd is a wonderful victory. May 3rd is a knockdown, drag out fight. Hooker has entrenched, and now you've got a lot of a lot of soldiers that are ready for a fight on the Union side. They've dug in. One of these men that gets hit really hard is General Winfield Scott Hancock. And during my series on my series on him during the Battle of Chancellorsville, he performs really well. But Hooker is being attacked. There's a little salience, kind of a mule shoe or a horseshoe kind of formation, and he's being hit in all directions, and he eventually has to pull back. But it's not because he's not. It's not out of being timid. It's just the Union soldiers are having a hard time holding that ground consistently, but they're holding it with all their might. They're doing a great job, but this is to secure the entire line. He has to kind of pull back. So it's not because the Confederates really broke their line. You would say they do, but it's not. It's not a disaster like May 2nd.
I mean,
You understand what I'm saying?
yeah, and
Okay.
I mean the Confederates suffered a lot of casualties. Couldn't have Hooker just weathered the storm and launched another counterattack because he still had so many forces?
He's got a lot of forces and he's outnumbering Lee on. Lee has had to divide his force, and so now he's outnumbers Lee in two different sectors of the battlefield. And it's at this moment that he actually requests for Sedgwick, who is the commander of the two corps that are at Fredericksburg, to
Okay.
launch an attack to kind of take some pressure off of him. And because Robert E. Lee only has about 15,000 men in front of Fredericksburg guarding against Sedgwick, Sedgwick pushes across. Now I'll give it to you. Got to give it to Jubal Early. He's able to hold off. He's at Mary's Heights, and he's able to hold off the Union Army there for quite a while. But it's a good delaying action. And what he does, it's really neat. He starts to pull south instead of going west to meet with Lee. Early moves south. He's delayed Sedgwick enough that Lee, again, this is the fourth time, he divides his force again.
Oh, I didn't know about that one.
He divides his force another time. So he leaves Stuart with Jackson's divisions of Hill, Rhodes, and Colson.
God.
And then he sends McLaws' division back towards Fredericksburg. And McLaws hits Sedgwick's men. They're able to hold off for just a little bit now near Salem Church. It's a bitter struggle, but they're able to hold on. He takes more troops from Stuart's front and moves Anderson's division from Longstreet's corps. And by this point, Early, because he's moved south, can move in behind Sedgwick. And so now he's actually surrounded General Sedgwick when he has came across the river.
I didn't. Man, I didn't. This is talk about everything falling into place.
It absolutely does. He has divided his men. If you count Longstreet's division, dividing Longstreet from him earlier in that spring, he has divided his force 4 times in this battle, and is able to bluff a larger force. Eventually, Sedgwick has to retreat across the river, and now he's got Hooker left on this south side of the river, and Robert E. Lee uses his artillery effectively. He pounds the Union lines around the Rapidan and Rappahannock, where the Rapidan and Rappahannock River meet, and Hooker is pretty much forced to move back across the river. It's an amazing feat. And now I don't think it's a complete. People usually stop on Jackson's flanking maneuver. That was a victory. Yeah, this stopped Hooker in his tracks. It was an amazing thing he did. It wasn't a masterful victory as far as destroying a large segment of the Union Army, but it definitely put them in their place. And one of the outcomes of the Battle of Chancellorsville is Hooker gets replaced.
Would you say that the way Hooker had him, that this was a Hail Mary that Lee connected on?
That it was a Hail Mary for Lee?
Yeah.
Oh yes. And Lee had no other option. Um, he was going to be trapped in between 2 armies. Uh, he could have pulled back. Now that would have been an option, to pull back to Richmond. That's what Hooker was hoping he would do. When he crossed the Rappahannock River, he was really hoping for Lee to start to pull back and retreat towards Richmond, and then he would pursue. When Lee completely flips the script on him, that's when he starts to buckle and he starts to pull back.
Yeah. So they try to discount that as call a Pyrrhic victory or whatever. I hate that term because I've always said if there was more Pyrrhic victories in the West, the Confederacy would have won. I mean, to me, that's still one of the most amazing victories that they could pull off the way they did that. I didn't even know there was 4 times he divided his army.
4 times he separated his army, and by this point, when he takes Anderson and McLaws' divisions away from Stuart has somewhere over 20,000 men, and Hooker has 70,000. That's what's opposing Hooker, and at that location. If Hooker would have been the aggressor, he could have won. It wouldn't have taken that much. It just boggles my mind. But one reason Hooker doesn't perform well at Chancellorsville is during the battle on May 3rd, I believe it is, an artillery shell hits a wooden pillar near the house that he's using for headquarters, and it falls on him. It gives him a concussion, most likely. And so he's unconscious for about an hour. And he wakes up, he's groggy. He's definitely not himself, but he refuses to hand over command to General Couch. And so it's a weird situation, but it's definitely a wonderful victory for the Confederacy. They've done something that most generals could never have done in their wildest dreams. But it's not a decisive victory. I say decisive. It's not a battle of annihilation where Robert E. Lee has destroyed this huge amount of Union soldiers.
Right.
It's not like Canine with Hannibal. He simply held on. At Chancellorsville, the Union Army has almost somewhere around 130,000 men. They lose 17,000. They're still not less than 100,000 men. It's Robert E.
Lee
Lee
lost what, 13 or 14?
Almost 13,000 men. Yeah. And he only has 60,000. So that is significant. He's lost over a sixth of his army there.
Gosh.
So it's, when we look at it from that direction, I don't think you could say this is Lee's greatest victory or most perfect victory. I would probably if you're going to hand one of Lee's greatest victories, it's got to be Second Manassas. That's probably his greatest one he ever pulled off, and it really wasn't him doing it. It was very much Stonewall along with Stuart. It was his corps commanders and his cavalry commander who pulled that off better than anyone.
Well, one that I say, because strategically, I'd say it's a loss, but tactically, tactically to me, he won this battle is the way he performed at Antietam, moving his forces to meet each thrust, and that was masterful the way he handled that.
It was. I think. Did we discuss that? We might have. We have not talked about Antietam on this
No, I thought
show,
we discussed it
but
off.
but we've discussed it. I think in between different battles we've
Mhm.
discussed. Yeah, I would throw that one up there too. Even though it's a strategic loss for the Confederacy, the Battle of Antietam, Robert E. Lee being able to maneuver troops across and across this battlefield, he does a masterful job at that.
Oh yeah, I mean, just way he shifted. It kind of remind me of the Allies at Bastogne.
It's fun analyzing these battles and being able to get a bird's eye view of some of these. And when you see someone, is Lee overrated? I think somewhat overrated, but I don't think you can count out all of his victory. This is not luck. He is taking gambles that turn out well. He gambles with Grant, and that's a different story. So we can definitely tell when gambling works and when it doesn't is when you've got a timid opponent. That's when gambling works the best.
Well, I heard a guy say one time that some of Lee's victories was because of pure blind luck, and I said, well, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. I mean,
He was, I think he was lucky. He was extremely lucky here.
so how much, I hear this all the time. How much, if any, did Jackson's death play in the remainder of the war? I mean, I tell people all the time, look, one man's not going to make a difference. I mean, it was a major loss, but I don't think it had an impact on the outcome.
I have a video about this on my channel,
Okay.
and I don't see it changing. Jackson's death isn't anything, and I absolutely hate when people say that if Jackson was at Gettysburg, it would have been different. Yeah, it might have been different. It might have been different, but the outcome of the war is not going to change. And honestly, if you listen to Hancock when he talks about Gettysburg, I don't. Hancock had Cemetery Hill well scouted and had troops there. There was no one going to take Cemetery Hill.
Well, the thing that I said is when people were saying, Jackson would have taken the hill, I said, well, if it would have been two corps, maybe he would have had a chance, but not divided into three
Mhm.
with Ewell. I said, and Ewell was staring down the barrel of 30 cannon and 10,000 men, and only had 17,000 present. And Anderson's division didn't go. It would have been a slaughter if he tried to take that hill.
But even you even have to step back even from that situation, because would Jackson have moved the way that Hill and Ewell would have moved into Pennsylvania? I don't think so. They're completely different
That's
people.
true.
So I don't even know if Gettysburg would have even taken place had Jackson been there. Especially wouldn't have taken place the way it did. But I don't know if it would even have taken place at that town. It might have happened near Harrisburg. It might have been a little bit further north. It could have been further south. We don't know. But I do not see Jackson maneuvering his corps the same way.
That's true. I didn't even think about it that way. I mean, I think Gordon was all the way in Wrightsville.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've actually got a video on that going to be coming up probably in June. Probably in June.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that with the way they maneuvered them, and that's a good point too. Yeah, I get so tired of that about Jackson taking that hill and blah blah. And then the thing too about this, because the order take that hill if practical, but avoid bringing on a general engagement. They said you'll just wadded the paper and threw it on the ground. He doesn't know how to give an order.
Yeah, I mean, Jackson's death is extremely influential because it does lower the morale of the Confederacy, if only for a few months. They are grieved at that because Jackson has been portrayed as almost a godlike figure on the battlefield to the Confederate civilians. And so when they hear that he dies, that does take a morale hit to the South. However, many of these people's morale is tied to Robert E. Lee and his army. Jackson was only a part of that, and so we see that Confederate nationalism really start, and instead of being spread out over Jackson and Lee, it gets more funneled toward Lee, and so it only makes them more eager to fight when Jackson dies.
Do you think some of the myth or legend or whatever of Jackson today is because he went out on his finest moment? I mean,
I think so. that's with anyone. That's with celebrities or anyone. If you go, it's like think of Heath Ledger in The Dark Knight. I don't think it would
Right.
gain nearly as much gain nearly as much notoriety if he hadn't have died shortly after it. And Jackson's the same way.
I wonder why. Somebody was telling me that I can't remember why the pneumonia set up in him. I think he says something about the way the wound. I can't remember, but I can ask him. But one of my moderators, I can't remember. He explained to me. He's a doctor. Explained to me what happened that caused the pneumonia set up in him and as opposed to other people. And then I think the surgeon did the most amputations. He did Jackson's and Yule's leg.
Mm-hmm.
So what else can we add to Chancellorsville?
Well, I think we should end it on this gives Robert E. Lee. Not only does Jackson die from the Battle of Chancellorsville, not only is Hooker replaced by George Meade, but it gives Robert E. Lee the confidence because now he's defeated this large Union army. It gives Lee the confidence to move north, and so we I don't know what we'll discuss next, but I say probably in July we'll probably tackle Gettysburg. We might run up to the Battle of Brandy Station or a few other battles that kind of lead up to Gettysburg. But this sends Lee on a trajectory towards the fight at Gettysburg.
Okay, well, I'm gonna say, and I'll tell you a few that somebody suggested. But anyway, man, thanks a lot. We'll get back soon.
That sounds great, buddy. Thank you.